Thank you all for coming today. My name is Jerry Schindel, and I am honored to basically introduce Jim Pisarowicz, our Wednesday Luminary speaker for 2025. I've known Jim for many, many years. His NSS number is 16872. He's a fellow of the Society, a Lew Bicking Award member, award winner, and also a member of the Explorers Club. Jim started caving with his sister in St. Paul, Minnesota when he was 4 years old, entering many sandstone caves in the area back when you could play in caves at the age of 4. Eventually he joined the NSS when he joined the Colorado Grotto in the early 70s. Jim was one of the few cavers at the time who owned a wetsuit, as he was also a diver, and got involved in the exploration of Spring Cave, Colorado, involving multiple sump dives. His caving has spread down to Mexico and Central America, and eventually to Papua New Guinea. He has worked as a park ranger at Wind Cave National Park, where he led the exploration team to survey the cave's 40th mile in 1984 and beyond. Today, Wind is the 7th longest cave in the world at over 154 miles. Jim has published hundreds of articles on caving and was one of the initial editors of the Journal for Cave and Karst Studies and co-editor of several issues of the AMCS Activities newsletter. Jim founded and directed the NSS Caves of Tabasco project with groundbreaking exploration and research in the Cueva de la Luz and his chemoautotrophic ecosystems. He returned to academia as a professor in psychology, math, and statistics at Antioch University, Colorado Mesa University, and Sinclair Community College in Ohio. When Jim is in caving, he is an award-winning wildlife photographer and co-author of 2 books on the Colorado wildflowers, and as part of our shameless commerce portion of the Jim, I think, has some books with him, and you may wish to get them.
They're selling them.
They're selling them over across the hall, and they are outstanding. If you are interested in wildflowers of Colorado, they are well worth picking up. It is my pleasure to introduce Jim Pisarowicz as the 2025 NSS Luminary Speaker with his talk title, "Seems as if all the decisions in my life have were because I am a caver." So, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, sir.
You know, I was a caver even before I became a caver. When I was very young, there it is. This is my mom and dad. I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, hub of all big-time caving. You know, it's like everybody that knows Minnesota knows that it's the place to go caving. And so at a very young age, here I am with my sister and my cousin Michael, and not too far from our home was a city park called Battle Creek, and the number of sandstone caves in that area. Most of them are just shelters. But when I was about 4 years old, we went around the back of this hill, and my dad gave my sister and I a flashlight, and they said, "Go explore that cave there." And it was the perfect cave for a little kid to explore, because the floor was flat, it was sand, the cave went in about 120 feet, turned off to the left, went about 75 feet longer, and ended. There were no drop-offs or anything else, but as a little kid of 4 years old, going by yourself with your little sister down into this cave, it was like, wow, what a great adventure. As I got older, I discovered that by riding my bicycle around, I could visit some other caves in the area, and our nearby park was called Indian Mountains Park. It was a Native American burial site. But at the base of this big cliff was another famous cave in Minnesota called Carver's Cave, or Wonton to be in the local vernacular. And it was the original site of the white settlers coming in and talking with some of the native people about whether or not they could set up a settlement in this particular area. Every time I would go there, the cave was closed off because it was right at the bottom of a cliff. The railroad junctions came right through that area, and as the trains rumbled through, the sandstone would come sloughing off and close the entrance to the cave. But I went there many, many times and never got into the cave, but it was something that I was really interested in. You know, Minnesota is not a great place to start caving, especially if you live up in St. Paul, because as everybody knows, most of that whole area has been, the limestone has been scraped off by glaciers, other than this area here called the driftless area. And until I got to graduate school, I didn't own a car. So there's no way I could get to some place like that until I was much older. My family was divided up into two different sections. We have my Minnesota family, which is my mom and my grandma and grandpa and some aunts. And then there's the New Jersey part of the family, which was in Jersey City. And my dad, after World War II, left Jersey with some of his friends, and they were going to go to Alaska to become rich in the gold mines up there. Well, I don't know if he knew what he was talking about, but he made it as far as St. Paul, Minnesota. He had a boyhood friend that was living there. I refer to him as my Uncle Alex. And he met my mom, and he stayed there, and his friends left. And that is the start of my family that I recognize. Now, when I was 10 years old, I was up in my room playing with, I don't know, army soldiers or something, and my mom came upstairs and she said, "Do you want to go visit your grandmother?" And I thought, wow, that's great. I like going over to my grandma's house, this grandmother right here. And she said, "Well, you're going to go over to grandma's house for about a week or so pack yourself a bag." And I did that through a bunch of underwear and all the other kinds of things that kids think of when they're going to visit their grandmother. And I come walking downstairs. My bedroom was upstairs. And I come down to the family dinner table. And my mom and my dad are there, and they're looking halfway worried. And I said, "Well, I'm all ready to go." My dad gets up. He walks over to me. He opens up his wallet. I'm like 10 years old, and hands me some 20s and 10s and 5, hands me $100 in cash. And he says, "Okay, do you know where the bus is?" And I says, "Yeah." He says, "You cross the street," and the bus stop was right there. And he says, "Well, take the bus downtown St. Paul. You know where the train station is?" And I said, "Sure." And he says, "Buy yourself a train ticket to go to this grandmother." And at 10 years old, I got on the bus, got downtown in St. Paul. Here is the train depot in St. Paul. Bought myself a ticket. The train went to Chicago, and Chicago had to change trains and buy another train ticket. And then I ended up in Penn Station in New York, and my aunts and uncles from New Jersey were there to pick me up. So that's the kind of family I was in. That's the kind of expectation they had for their kids, that at 10 years old they can go off and then my aunts and uncles in that area, one of my uncles was coming back to visit, and I rode back to St. Paul with my uncle. When I got back to the end of the summer there, and of course you go back to school, and kids coming off their summer vacation, you come to school and the teacher says, "Okay, today we want you all to write a theme about what I did on my summer vacation." So I wrote my theme on what I did in my summer vacation. I got to take the train and all this other kind of stuff. And then the teacher has all the students read their themes. And I'm up there reading my theme about how I got to ride the train and all by myself and everything else. And my mom tells me a few years later, she says, the night after you did that first day in school that year, I got a phone call. And she answers the phone, and the woman in the phone says, "Are you Jimmy Pisarowicz's mother?" And she says, "Well, yeah, I'm Mrs. Pisarowicz." And this woman says to her, "Jimmy told the class that last summer he rode the train to New York all by himself. Did he do that?" And my mom says, yeah, he did do that. And then the woman said something like, "Well, oh shit," or oh shoot, because now I've been telling my son, who's in my class, that he's too young to get a BB gun. And now I'm going to have to buy him a BB gun, because how can I say you're too young to have a BB gun if Jimmy is riding the train to New York all by himself? So that is how I live my younger life. When I was hit high school, I applied for a National Science Foundation grant to spend a summer at Humboldt State University. At that time, I think it's Humboldt California Polytechnic, and to study oceanography because I was interested in oceanography. So I got to fly out. They actually paid all my expenses to fly out San Francisco and then up to Eureka, and then they picked me up and put me in a dorm. Went out on an oceanography vessel, studied marine biology and advanced mathematics, and that's how I spent my summer between my junior and senior year in high school. So when I graduated, it was like, well, I'm going to be an oceanographer. And so I applied for and was accepted at the University of Washington in Seattle. Now this is like 1969, and the riots are going on. I lived in the dorm. Not far from where our dorm was the main avenue for the university. The students were having a riot there because of the war, and the police decided to intervene by tear gassing them. The problem was they didn't watch which direction the wind was blowing. So they shot the tear gas over the students rioting, and the wind blew all the tear gas into the dormitories. And now suddenly 1,000 more people are going out onto the street, and they're pissed off because they weren't causing any sort of problems, but now they're running out of the dorm, their eyes watering and such. That was the era that I was going to school. I started off my classes. University of Washington has an excellent oceanography program. One of the problems was it was very strict. Your first 2 years, you're required to take 30 credit hours of chemistry. And then starting your second year, your second and third year, in those years you had to take 30 credit hours of physics. During that time period, you had to take at least 15 hours of mathematics above calculus. And I discovered I hated chemistry. I know a lot of my friends are chemists and such, and I hated chemistry. I did well in it. I got all A's in all my classes and everything. I hated chemistry, and I went, man, if I'm going to have to do all this chemistry to be an oceanographer, I don't want to be an oceanographer. So I literally went down and quit school. And what if somebody quit school in the late 60s and early 70s? Where are they going to go? You're going to go to California? You're going to go to San Francisco. So I said, well, I'm heading for San Francisco. I grabbed a duffel bag with a bunch of stuff in it. And how does a kid, like an 18-year-old get and doesn't own a car, how does he get to San Francisco? You stick out your thumb. So I got my thumb out and get a ride down to the coastal areas of Oregon. And I'm down there, got my thumb out. I started looking for a ride, and this speedy car goes past us. It might have been a Porsche or something else of that era. And the car was flying by me really, really fast. And then you could tell that the car just quickly stopped because whoever was driving the car puts his foot on the brake, and the car stops like that, not just like this slow. It goes boom, 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 it stops. And I go run over to the car, and the guy says, "Where are you going, man?" And I says, "I'm going to San Francisco." And he says, "That's where I'm going. Jump in." So I jump in the car, sort of throw my bag sort of behind the seat. And I'm looking at this guy, and I'm going, man, he looks really familiar, And I'm talking with him, and I'm looking at him, spend more time looking at him. And the guy that picked me up was this guy, Peter Fonda. So I'm driving along there, and finally I figured out who he is. And we're talking, and I said, "Oh, where are you going?" He said, "Well, I'm going to San Francisco." I said, "No." But I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, I'm going to San Francisco to catch a plane to go visit my sister who's in Hawaii." And he says, "Do you want to go?" And I say, "Yes." So we get to Seattle, or get to San Francisco, and I think he probably had a rental car or something, and takes me out to the airport and buys me a ticket. And the two of us fly out to Hawaii. We get there. Jane was there for some party or something that's going on. It might have been her birthday, but it was a big party was going on. And so I'm in there partying, hobnobbing with all these famous, movie stars and that kind of stuff. And when the party's sort of over, he says, "Well, what are you going to do?" He says, "I'm going to stay in Hawaii." And he says, "Well, great, have a good time." And basically my plan at this point was I was going to go to the North Shore of Hawaii and go surfing, and scuba diving and diving and everything else. And this is actual picture, the North Shore of Hawaii, and this is the only thing that was there. This little, like a beach house for burgers and such. And today, and I tell people that I did that. I've been to Hawaii many times, and I says, yeah, I mean, that was the age. And they said, where did you stay? I says, I'd go behind here. There was a pineapple plantation. I'd sleep in the pineapple plantation. And they said, you can't do that. And I said, well, back then you could. That's all condos now. I was there for a couple months, and then finally it was like, well, I guess I can't do this the rest of my life. And it didn't strike me that really I could, but I thought, well, I guess I can't do that. And so I headed back to Minnesota to tell my folks that I had quit school and have been living in Hawaii for the last couple months. So I get back there, and then I got to a school called Hamline University, and I was going to see caves nearby. There were still riots in the streets. Here's riots right outside our campus. So again, this is the area, and it's like, well, what's going to be your major? I decided to be a math major, and at this school, all you had to do was have 4 classes above a certain level to have a math major. Well, they accepted my advanced placement with credit from the University of Washington, but by about my third quarter or third semester, I had already finished my math major and still had like 2.5 years to finish. So I started taking some psychology classes, which I liked, but when I graduated, I decided to go into psychology rather than mathematics. And so I applied at the University of Denver, here at the University of Denver, and I started working with John Horn, this fellow right here, and we worked at the prison. And he was doing some studies on intellectual abilities, and one of the problems that he was encountering is that when you want to look at how people's abilities change over time, it's really hard to keep track of people for like 30 or 40 years. But if they're in prison, you can go and find them years later. And he actually did a number of studies to show that the people in prison, not as far as how high their intelligence and such was, but the constellation, how all those intelligence fit together, were exactly the same as the general population, except for everything was shifted about 1/3 of a standard deviation lower. Well, I was there, I got in trouble because I discovered that we had all this data on the prisoners, but I also had all the data on all the guards. And I wrote a paper about the guards. And I went to publish it. I had to run it through the state publication stuff. And I remember sitting in my office over at the college or university, and it's a letter from the governor of Colorado, and says, "Come to my office, please." And I went there, and he says, "You can't do this." I says, "I'm doing exactly the same stuff with that data as the data I'm using on the prisoners." And he says, "Well, you can't do that." And I says, "Well, yeah." He said, "Do you stand by the stuff?" And I said, "Yeah." And he wasn't happy. I said, "I quit." I also was doing research on how kids do good things, or things like share and that kind of stuff. And that's what I did for my master's. And then I got involved with the Indo-Chinese War refugees. So this is Peter Van Arsdale, and he's a professor of anthropology. And so I started working with him on Indo-Chinese war refugees and how they are adapting psychologically to the United States. Oops. I was going caving in the time. Well, finally I got to a state that has some good caves. And I had really good caving equipment, was not involved in the NSS. In Minnesota, before I moved out there, a lot of the cavers there were very anti-NSS. So I was caving a bunch, but the people I was caving with started graduating or moving on, and I was sort of running out of people to go caving with. And one day I was out caving, and Alan Williams here comes up to me and says, "Wow," he says, "Oh, I don't know who you are." He says, "Are you NSS?" I said, "No." He says, "I just like to go caving," because he's looking at me. I had, instead of flashlights and stuff, I had a carbide lamp and a good helmet and all sorts of kind of stuff. He says, "You should join the Colorado Grotto." And I says, "Well, okay," because I just was running out of people to go caving with. So I went to the first meeting, Colorado Grotto meeting at the time. Met Norm Pace here, Donald Davis, Tom Taylor, and Norm was doing the program at that meeting, and he was doing a program, one of his old programs about his trip to Berger. So it's the first time you go to the meeting, meet Norm Pace, and I didn't know he was a famous caver, and he was talking about caving in the world's deepest caves over in France, and it's like, whoa, this is pretty cool. And so at that same meeting, Le Grotto was planning to go into Spring Cave, because they were going to do a dive. At the end, you walk in the Spring Cave, and you got about a mile of passageway to get to the sump, and they're trying to explain how to all the people that they were trying to recruit to be tank Sherpas, that they needed to get a wetsuit, and how to go down and rent yourself a wetsuit at a dive shop and everything else. And I said, I want to be on this trip, and they're sort of like, who are you? You're just a new guy. And I said, well, yeah. I said, I have a wetsuit. And they're like, most of the cavers didn't have a wetsuit. And so he says, well, you can come, because you look like you had the right gear and you've got a wetsuit. So here I am in Spring Cave. The first trip we carried tanks back for a couple of the members to dive the sump. That's actually Sue Schindel in the sump in the water there, back when I knew her before marriage name. But anyway, we went back in there and dove through the sump, and they got to the other side, and there's a big passageway there, and then they just came back. So it's like, now we need to go back. And I said to the people who organized this, says, well, I'm a diver, I'm a dive instructor. And they said, well, have you gone on any cave diving? This is in the early 1980s, and not too many people went cave diving. It's like for sure not in Colorado. And I said, well, yeah, I haven't done any cave diving, but when I was in Minnesota, we used to dive under the ice. We used to go out with a chainsaw and cut a big hole in the ice, and then we'd jump in there and go. And I said, that's sort of like cave diving, because if you have a problem, you can't just go up. You got to swim back to the hole you originally went in. And I says, isn't that like cave diving? Other than the fact that it's not dark. And at that point, I knew that I was more qualified to do diving than any of the people that was actually going to do that. So myself, Norm Pace, and Tom Taylor were the divers for the next trip. And so we went through the first sump, went a half a mile through the passageways. Oh no, there's a second sump. We had to go back, move all that gear to the second sump. Go through the second sump, go down a passageway. Oh, a third sump. Take the gear over there. At the end of the third sump, you popped up to the surface, and you're right at the bottom of a big waterfall. Come down on your head. And we said, well, we dumped our gear. So I think we can climb this waterfall, and go down the passageway. And there's another big lake. We go back and haul all of our gear up the waterfall, get to the fourth sump. And I remember sitting there at that sump, putting on my all my dive gear, but still have my wetsuit and everything on, but putting on my neoprene headpiece and gloves and everything else. And I was so cold. I was just sitting there shivering. And I'm trying to put all this stuff on. And in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, what are the symptoms of hypothermia? Uncontrollable shivering. Well, that was me. Your judgment is not well. I'm going, well, I'm going to put all this stuff on and dive into this other sump. And I figured, well, my judgment was at least well enough to dive into the sump. So we put on all of our gear, dived down, and unlike the previous sumps, it didn't go flat, it went deep. And before you know it, we're 75 feet underwater. And we're in a big room with boulders as big as houses all around us. And we looked at our air, and it's like, we got to turn around right now. Because if we don't, we're going to need to get out of this sump, go through the third sump, go through the second sump, and then go through the long first sump to get out. And I remember finally getting out, and we just dumped all of our gear, and all three of us just headed for the entrance. Well, the best time to dive in this cave is late fall, and we get out of the cave, and it's snowing outside. And we're walking down, so it was a fair distance coming down, and we get down, and unfortunately all of our friends had a big bonfire going, and we go down and had to bang against the trees to get the ice out of our wetsuits. And that was some of my first diving, or first caving in Colorado. Well, you know, like I got sort of enamored with a spring cave, and I'd read an article by Rain Curl about how you can figure out how fast water is flowing through passageways by looking at scallops. So I looked at all these scallops and says, well, I should go in there and measure all those scallops. And I got Sue back there, and says, Sue, do you want to come up with me to measure scallops? And I remember sitting in the water with her, you know, really cold water, you know, measuring these scallops. And after a while, she was starting to shiver uncontrollably. And she was probably saying, oh, you know, is my judgment being impaired here because I'm going to die of hypothermia here? Well, we came out of the cave, and again it had snowed. We got back to Glenwood Springs, and then they had the big semis crashed into the road, and we couldn't get back to Denver. We stayed our time in the Springs, and then the road still wasn't open. Of course, we didn't have money to go to a motel, and I said, well, Blaine Colton just lives down the way here. Went over to Blaine's house. He wasn't there. We just opened the door and went in and camped at his house. So things opened and came back. Well, you know, like those early experiences in the Spring Cave led to my first papers and publications. So after the big diving stuff, I went down to the NSS convention at New Braunfels, did a paper on that, and everybody was like, oh yeah, that's really cool stuff, because not too many people, you know, cave diving wasn't like it is today, where lots and lots of people are trained and they do a lot of cave diving out there. You know, there's hardly any cave diving done other than Florida and such. And then the paper I did about the flow through the cave, the next couple of years I've figured out all the resurgences of the cave, measured how much water came out, figured out how to flow through the cave, used Rain Curl's calculations, and figured out that his calculations were supported by the research that I was doing on this particular cave, and did a paper at the International Congress about those sorts of things. So that's sort of my connection with all of that stuff. So I continued to cave with the Colorado Grotto. The Colorado Grotto got involved with other projects. I would go with Norm and Alan up on Silvertip thing. But I was also working with refugees when I wasn't doing caving. And I was organizing research all over the country, in Colorado and Minnesota and Texas and California. And I got all these people that were doing research, and I said, we should get together and put together a symposium about all this research. And they said, oh yeah, that would be great. And so I said, well, where are we going to present this? And I figured it was mostly anthropology research, and it was applied anthropology. So there's an organization called the Society for Applied Anthropology, and I said, hey, all you guys, you want to present papers at this conference? I'll set it up. Well, and they all said yes. And that year, the symposium, or their conference was in Mérida in Mexico. And I said, well, I've always wanted to go to the Yucatan, because I'd like to see the ruins, and also I knew that was all karst. And I said, well, that would be great. So one of the women I was working with, I said, and I was a bicyclist, and which is why this bicycle is here. And she was a bicyclist, and I said, do you want to go to Yucatan and go bicycling around and see all the ruins and stuff? And she says, yeah. And I said, great. You know, and a week later she came back and says, I can't go. And I says, well, why not? She says, my husband doesn't think it's a good idea. And I told her, I says, you know, like, you and I have nothing going on about anything like that. And she says, well, he doesn't like this idea. And I said, well, and I've always been, if I have an idea and I want to bring some other people with, if they don't go, I'm going to go anyway. She eventually divorced him anyway. So, so I pack up the bicycle, and it's actually this bicycle. I sold this bicycle to one of the guys in the grotto like 40 years ago, and I knew that he still had the bicycle. And so I called him up before this trip, and I said, can I borrow your bicycle? And I says, I'm going to talk about my bicycling trip to the Yucatan. And he says, yeah, you can take it. So I went over to his house. He hasn't been using it. It's not in good shape, but it's good enough shape to use as a prop for this thing. Okay, Gary, you can turn it off. 25 minutes? Okay. So here I am bicycling through the Yucatan. I would go to the ruins like this. back then, things were not like they are today. You know, I actually climbed on top of the pyramids and slept up there at night. I bicycle along. You get to the Pook Hills, which is the southern part of that area, and it's just like it's rolling karst hills, caves everywhere. You know, you come and see caves everywhere. So my plan was to camp out along the way. And camping out, if I was close to where there were people, I had a little tent. Mostly I went just slashing my way with a machete off the trail, and had sort of this mosquito netting I put over the top of my head. And so one night I'm out sleeping in the jungle like that, just like this. Oh, yeah. And I could hear these sounds out in the jungle, this thrashing around sound. And now I'm awake and I'm sort of sitting up. I said, what in the world is going on? And then suddenly the sounds get louder and louder and louder. And suddenly, bam, something hits me and knocks me down. And what it was is there was a monkey, a holler monkey, running through the jungle in the dark. And it runs into my mosquito netting, and it's getting tangled in there, and it's in the dark, and I'm trying to push this monkey off of the top of me. And of course, there's a reason why the monkey is running through the jungle at night. And suddenly I'm knocked back down again. It was being chased by a jaguar. And I'm on the bottom of this pile, this monkey on top of me, this jaguar on top of him, and I'm trying to push them off. And I reached under my sleeping pad, pull out a machete, and I just go whack in the dark. And I hear this scream. And in one direction, something runs. In the other direction, something runs. Turn on my light, and I'm sitting there holding my machete, and I'm just shaking like this. And the blood is just drooling off the machete. And I'm going, whoa. Well, continued on, eventually showing up at my conference with all the refugees and such. Well, at the time, I had a sheepdog. I still have a sheepdog. And I was driving over, picking something up from the vet. And was at a stoplight, car stopped. I stopped. The big truck behind me didn't stop and smashed into me. And mostly the biggest injury was my elbow had smashed into something hard inside the car. And, you know, you ever hit your funny bone? You know how hard that hurts? I had that level of pain for almost 2 years. They couldn't get rid of it. You know, they gave me drugs. They did 4 different operations on my arm, and none of that worked. And, you know, there's nothing they could do. And finally, the doctor says, well, we've done all the surgical stuff, given you every drug we can possibly imagine, and we don't get rid of your pain. I couldn't move some of my fingers. I still have problems moving 2 of my fingers. And he says, well, our plan now is we're going to bring you into the hospital, we're going to tie you down and electrocute you. It was like, what? He said, yeah, we're going to put a probe in, like right on your back, and then one on the bottom, we're going to shoot electricity through you and electrocute you. They had to do that 5 times, and then finally, the pain sort of stopped. And I was like, oh, finally, the pain has stopped. But now I'm addicted to 3 different drugs. So now I had to go into the mental health hospital to deal with the addiction. And so I was in there for 2 weeks, and then for about 6 months to get me off of all these drugs I was addicted to. Well, personal things happened in my life, so I came out of the hospital, and I didn't have a home to go to anymore. Alan Williams stepped up and said, you can move in with me. So I moved in with him, and the caving I did was all on the surface. I went with Chris Albers here, and this is right when they made the connection between the top and the bottom of Great X. And I couldn't go caving, but I could hike still. Still couldn't move my hand too much. And Chris is a surveyor, and they were going to survey from the top of the cave to the bottom of the cave to find out how deep it is as far as a surface survey. So I went with him and helped him get that survey done. And then Tom and Louise Hose, Tom Strong, Louise Hose, let me stay with them. And we used to go caving. Caving, I would say, non-caving caving trips. So we go out to caving areas, and I would not go caving, but I'd be out there, you know, with the cavers. At that time, Larry Fish, I said, you know, like, I'm trying to get work done, and I can't write, and I can't use a typewriter. He said, what you need is a little computer, because it's easy to erase things. And so I bought this computer, and eventually Jerry Forney, Louise Hose, and myself had a little business. And Jerry got a subscription to a geology database. Louise went into the database and pulled out information on oil wells. I put that into a database, which that time, using this computer, the only spreadsheet program was VisiCalc. I had to buy a circuit board to make my Apple computer do that, and we made a bunch of money selling these until the oil companies figured they could make their own databases. They didn't need to buy them from us. Well, I also discovered that Tom Strong is a great birder. He's really into woodpeckers. But living with them, I discovered that he was not happy with his job. And I said to him, if you're not happy, you should do something else. And he's like, well, it's really hard to turn down a job that really pays a lot of money. And I finally convinced him that, you're really interested in woodpeckers. Maybe we should go out and look for the big woodpecker, the imperial woodpecker, bigger than the ivory-billed woodpeckers. These woodpeckers only live in Mexico. And I said, we could go down. I said, if you quit your job, I'll buy a new truck. Well, I'll go with you for a couple months and look for woodpeckers. Then you and I will go down and hook up with some caving stuff in southern Mexico. And he said, well, I can't be out gone that long. I said, well, you just come back. You'll fly back, and we'll do that. And that's what we did. And bought this truck. Here we are in the state of Durango. And we're looking across this area. And what we're going to do is basically all of the green sections here, we're going to hike across those areas looking for these woodpeckers. And we did. We did not find the woodpeckers. We found lots of, we shot lots and lots of pictures of woodpeckers, lots of notes of people we talked to. And before we headed off to the other side of Mexico to go caving, my truck was broken into. Of course, they would steal the cameras and the binoculars. And unfortunately, all the exposed film was in the bag with that stuff. And all the notes from our trip was in there, and we lost all the film and all the notes. 37 years later, somebody wrote a book called Imperial Dreams about looking for this same woodpecker. I read his book. He went to almost every place that we went to, talked to some of the same people. He didn't find the woodpecker either. But it's like, this could have been Tom Strong's book. But we couldn't do that because we didn't have the data. So we went over the other side of Mexico, traveled down to southern Mexico, and go through this thing slides really fast, back in those days. And got into the Quetzalcoatl area, and we were down there looking at the karst there, and found some caves with cool artifacts and everything in them. And eventually Tom had to go back to the States. And I hooked up with Steve Knudsen and Bill Liebman and a bunch of other people, and we're down in Xochitlan, starting to explore a cave called Santa Elena. Really cool cave. Lots and lots of rope drops. So you head into the cave, you drop a rope, swim, drop a rope, swim, drop a rope. And we started off, there was about 2 cusecs of water at the entrance. By the time you're down about 10 drops, you get about 20 cusecs of water. And we're having problems because there was so much water, you couldn't swim or make your way back against the current. So we had to go in town and buy lots and lots of this floating rope, and basically ran that down the things, and you got it in your Jumars, and you had to climb up all the streams. We got down about, it's very sporting. And we got when we went underneath the town, it was all sewage. Oh, yeah, yes. We've had lots of people talk about sewage in caves. And we finally got to a spot where we could get out of the water and up into this room right here. Very difficult to get into. I had to be belayed at the top of a waterfall. There was nothing to hook up. So I was on a belay line at that point, and then Steve Knudsen came in there and had to do an aid climb, and I belayed him up the aid climb to get to this room. We came out, that was about 20 drops or so into the cave. Well, the next group of we were doing a team working down in the cave. The next group went in, and they were going through this little sluice shots. Warren Anderson was along on the trip, and he had gotten out of the water as they were going down there. And I think Dave Walker and Bill Liebman was in the water, and Dave said, "I think the water is coming up." And Bill says, "Well, how can you tell?" He says, "Well, look at a spot on the water, on the wall, look away, and then look back." And now it's underwater. And about that time, this big wave comes into the cave and starts washing these guys down towards the next waterfall. Warren Anderson was above. He had his Jumars with slings on him. He hooks the Jumars together, runs ahead, throws it down. They grab on to the thing. He held them so they didn't go over the waterfall while they scampered back up to the area above here. And they went, "Ooh," and the water keeps coming up. They climbed up the walls of the cave. They put some bolts in the walls and bolted themselves to the wall of the cave. And they were there for days. Meanwhile, we're up on the surface going, "Ooh, we know what it's like here. We know what it's like there." And we eventually went in. Water went down enough, got down there, and it's like there they were. And we got it. We got them out anyway. But now no one wants to go in this side of the cave anymore. So we try to figure out where the water comes out. You know, the typical caver thing. Go and find all of the influxes, put in dyes, chart it all out. All the water comes out the same place. And so we go to the bottom and start looking. It's easier traveling through the cave down than up. So we got into this big room, and we couldn't find a way to get to where the water was. And Steve did a 50-meter bolt climb in that room. This is back before we had hammer drills, and it was a twist, put in a bolt, tie sling, step up, another one, 50 meters. It opened up into a big passageway. We eventually saw the water with, here's our rigging from above. So we know that it connects. Went to the International Congress while we were there, got hooked up with going to Papua New Guinea, spent time in Papua New Guinea having helicopter gear, and, shipped tons of gear by ship across the ocean. Set up a base camp, and out of the base camp, we had 30 people on the expedition, and so groups of people would get a bunch of food, get together, and head out of the base camp for a week or so, and then look for caves, come back after a week to get resupply, R&R in our base camp, and we did a lot of caves doing that. Well, like most cave expeditions, the big cave is always discovered at the end of the expedition. And not only was it at the end of the expedition, it was a long ways away. It was basically in the next mountain range. So the guys were over there, and they're down like 400 meters or something, and it's still going. They ran out of rope and food. They sent a message back to the base camp, says we need food, we need ropes, and Louise and I packed up some packs, 40 kilos plus of gear and stuff, and we headed off walking this gear over. It would take us 3 days to get there. Well, as I was walking across this area, and there's sort of like glacial tarns, I stepped in one and wrenched my knee. And they sent a message back to the base camp. We have fortunately had 2 doctors in camp, and they came out and said, "Well, you need to go back to Australia." The helicopter company wouldn't come out for us. They wanted cash. They wanted $10,000 in cash before they took off. We had insurance. We said, "We got insurance." They said, "We want cash." And fortunately, the gold mining company guaranteed their payment. They came and picked me up after they held the plane. There's only 2 flights a week go out of there. They held the plane for 2 days. I get there by helicopter, get on the plane, showing my ticket, and they says, "This ticket's no good." And I said, "What?" "Yeah, this is good, next month. It's not good now." And finally I had to reach into my wallet, and I pulled out my charge card and handed it to her. "Is this good?" And she went, "Get on the plane." And went to Australia and got rehabbed in Australia. And then moved down to Austin, Texas to be with the AMCS, because I was doing all my caving down there. But during that time, I was also doing some of my anthropology work, and I was writing chapters for books for this guy, Anthony Oliver Smith. And he said, do you want to get involved in a refugee problem in Africa? I said, yeah, I'm willing to go to Africa for that. So he says, well, I'll get together back with you about going to Africa. And he says, figure on that next summer. Well, in the meantime, a good friend of Tom's and I, who lived in Denver, wanted to come down and visit me in Austin. And she wanted to see the golden-cheeked warbler. And she arrives, and she did see that. And she arrived just as I was getting a thing from Tony, and he says, oh, I don't think our grant is going to go through to go to Africa. And I'm like, oh, what am I going to do next summer? And he said, well, look for academic, teach some classes at UT or something. And I'm home there talking with Tina, and she says, I know what you should do in the summer. You should work for the National Park Service. And I went, what? I'm an academic. I'm not a park ranger kind of guy. And she actually goes and gets me an application, brings it home, and I filled out the application with just a pencil. And I threw it at her and said, well, here, I finished the application, so shut up, sort of thing. And so we're now planning a trip down to Guatemala. And so I'm going down to Guatemala, coming down from Austin. Steve and his crew are coming down from Portland, and we're going to meet down here in Guatemala. Well, I get to the Guatemalan border with Mary Standifer, and I say, how are things in Guatemala? And they say, well, things are really, really cool. And he says, great. He says, the only problem is that the Army is battling some rebels over here that are hanging out in caves. And it's like, well, that trip is not going to go. So, back in the days where you could just pick up your phone and call somebody else and say, it's going to be a no-go. We had plans to meet over in San Cristobal de las Casas with, well, anyway, he was an expat Brit, and so I talked with him. Shawcross, yeah. Who has been knighted. I don't know if you knew that or not. And so we went out to look to another area. We drove out to this town at the very end here. I'll just say this really quick because you can ask me questions. Out to this town here, and almost got killed by the people that were there. But the cars looked great. 30 years later, Louise Hose and I drove out to that same town with some Mexican officials to talk with them about what's going on here. And they almost decided to kill Louise and I and these 3 other Mexican officials. And it's like, the only town I've ever been with, they've attempted to murder me 2 different times. Here's all those people. Well, I got back, and on my answering machine, I had like 300 phone calls. And one of those phone calls was from Kay Rhodey, this woman right here. And I went, oh, I'll give her a call back. And she says, yeah, I saw your application, and I think I want to hire you for the summer. Is this up? Okay, 5? Okay. And I said, okay. Back in those days, you only could apply for 2 jobs with the Park Service, and she's offering me a job, and she's held it open for 2 months. So I packed up all my stuff in my vehicle and headed for South Dakota. And I get there at Wind Cave, and already was, Wind Cave was one of the big caves of the world. It was just a little bit under 39 miles long. And I get there, and it's like, oh man, I got to go caving. and so we arranged for a permit to go in the cave, and so I went in the cave with Warren Netherton, the only other person who was a caver there, and this woman named Karen Rozga, who she worked at Devil's Tower, and she was a climber there at the Devil's Tower. And so, well, if you're a climber, you can go caving. And we went in, we went into the cave, and we were going to stay there until we went over 40 miles. And we were 19 hours, and that's the little spot there. That's where Wind Cave went over 40 miles long. They wrote songs about me there. I need to talk about Belarus a little bit, but here's this song. It says, keep your chin to the wind, keep your carbide dry, keep the hard head on your head, the cave explorers cry. Here's some good advice, friends, we will give to you. Keep your chin to the wind, we'll meet at the model room. Cave explorers everywhere are more than just a myth. Chief among those hardy souls is Jim Pisarowicz. Wow. He explored in Wind Cave with care and grace and style, earned his fame and fortune, map in the 40th mile, and a bunch of other verses. And I'm going, wow, this is a cool place. Not only do I get to go caving, talk about caves, do cave stuff all the time, and I am greatly appreciated. So when I spent 18 years as a seasonal ranger at Wind Cave National Park, not all at once, but over a long period of time, and did some really great stuff, like getting the whole cave mapped out and fixing up a bunch of stuff, like figuring out a cave management plan, like getting the equipment in the park, computers to do that kind of work. Like Frank Reed came down and did some cave radio work, and they had no training of any of their staff at that time. They did their first NCRC training down there. Don Burkett and Steve Hudson and Noel Sloan were some of the instructors. Good thing they did that, because in 1989 there's this big rescue of Rachel Cox, which until Emily's rescue this is the biggest cave rescue in the United States, and fortunately found her and worked there. It was great. I loved it. And then Karen and I sort of got in together. We took a trip out to Yucatan, and coming back, I went into the town of Teapa, and I'm taking a picture of this church. And while I'm framing this picture, this little Indian woman comes up to grabs my shirt and starts pulling on it. And she says to me in Spanish, "There are lots of beautiful caves here." And I went, wow. I didn't even have a t-shirt on that said caves. And I took that as an omen I should come back and start caving there. And I did. It was hard to convince other people. So my old buddy Warren and I went down there one year, only the two of us for 2 months. Cave. And near the end, Warren had 2 days left before he had to come back. And the people in the town where we were would say, azufre, check azufre. And I go, azufre, sulfur, what am I interested in sulfur? And they said, we drove over to the town just to see what it was all about. And then they said, yeah, cave with the sulfur. You had to take a boat and pole your way till the end of the thing. And then Warren and I walked into this cave, and it was like, wow, something like I've never seen before. And got in there and saw these things that I call snottites. They look like stalactites that wiggled in the breeze. Collected samples of sulfur, sent all of that stuff off, very high levels of hydrogen sulfide, low levels of oxygen, high levels of carbon dioxide, all kinds of nasty stuff. pH of these things, I just had litmus paper at the time, 1, but down to like less than 0.1 pH. Pretty nasty place. Sent stuff up to Kim Cunningham to analyze the sulfur that we had in the cave, and it was isotopically light, indicating there's biological processes going on. Went to the NSS convention, tried to convince people to go there, and no one would want to go there. No one wanted to go there. And I finally convinced Louise Hose over here, to go there. And she got there, and it started, the big project of Via Luz took off. Gary, could you turn on the light? This is the last thing I'm going to do, because there's just too much to talk about. So I don't think most of us, we talk about things going viral. And I don't think, cave stuff doesn't go viral other than in the caving community. But this discovery that there are caves with chemoautotrophic biological systems in it that have everything from bacteria to mammals that live there and never leave. Well, the news gets out to some local newspapers where Louise was teaching it in Missouri, and there's a couple of those. And then it got picked up by Science Discovery Channel on their website. Here's another one, ABC News website, Science website, AMCS activity newsletters. It's written up. Oh, today's Science on File, that gets there. AMCS newsletter, Via Luz stuff. Trip to the Lighted House in the NSS, Michael Taylor, Earth Magazine, Smithsonian magazine explorations, Geotimes, Discovery magazine, New Scientist, and of course Journal of Cave and Karst Studies. We cover that because of course I was the editor there, and Louise was too. And then it gets covered again, there's sonatites there, Journal of Cave and Karst Studies, more stuff. Louise puts together a big symposium, Breakthroughs in Karst Geomicrobiology and Redox Geochemistry. Oh, the millennial issue, January 2000, National Geographic is talking about V. Lewis. People want to write articles for books. Science at the Extreme, Michael Taylor's book, Dark Life. Ew. Time magazine for kids. Microbe magazine for kids. National Geographic World for kids. Books for kids, Cave Sleuths. And it's covering that. Ripley's Believe It or Not. One of my favorites is Weekly Reader. I remember reading this as a kid. And and so all the kids in the country are reading about V. Lewis and snottites. Oh, how exciting. Movies are made about us, like the BBC did a thing, the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation did a thing, more books, and my favorite, sort of, U.S. News and World Report was going to write a big article on V. Lewis, and they contacted me about shooting my picture. And I went, wow, I get to have my picture on U.S. News and World Reports. And it's like, wow, I never thought that would ever happen to me in my life, and surely not as a caver, some caver discovery thing on U.S. News and World Reports. And when that issue came out, they dumped me as the person on there, Bill Clinton. The Monica Lewinsky thing can't happen just at that, but so to this day I hate Bill. I voted for him, but if he would have zipped up his pants a little bit better. That would have been my picture. Too much, and I'm just terrible about making time, so. Sorry, there's no way I could do it.
Okay.